Welcome to the Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of our 7 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading. And it's really nice to have people here in person, and it's really nice to have people on Zoom. And one of the things I'm aware of, is I miss knowing who's with us on Zoom because all these boxes are so tiny. So if you'll indulge me, I just want to see who's here. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. Okay, thank you. I feel like everybody's in the room in a different way now. So last week, we had a Dharma leader panel. We do that 2 or 3 times a year. And the topic was exploring how the Dharma informs our understanding of the invasion of Ukraine. And those of us who were on the panel had the opportunity to see in advance the questions that had been posed and to reflect on them. And there was so much more to be said than time allowed last week. And so I want to explore that topic a little further. One of the things I love about these Dharma leader panels that we do is that as Dharma leaders, we get to hear from each other what people's thoughts are. And it really makes it a much richer, I think, understanding. So I want to look a little further at the topic tonight with apologies that Joy and Debbie aren't here to add to this the way they did last week. So it is often said that the Dharma takes flight on the 2 wings of compassion and wisdom. And tonight I'd like to look at Ukraine from these 2 points of view. So the wing of compassion represents what are sometimes referred to as the heart teachings. And in actuality, this wing is more than compassion. But for this evening's talk, what I want to focus on with that wing is 2 of the 4 Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes. And those are metta, or loving kindness, and karuna, or compassion. Let me just say before I start, when I finished this talk, I was kind of looking at it and working with it, and I thought, this is kind of a downer, really. I was thinking, I wonder why this talk is a little bit of a downer. And then I thought, well, because what I'm talking about is a downer. And so I'm going to try to look at the upside of these as we go also. But the fact is that it's a fairly grim topic. It's useful, but it's grim. So as to karuna, or compassion, we cultivate an awareness of another's suffering. And when we look at the situation in Ukraine, it's not hard to see the suffering. Compassion, or karuna, it comes very easily when we look at Ukraine. It can be hard, though, to open up to the full scope of the losses in Ukraine. So I want you to bear with me for just a moment as I kind of connect with these unpleasant realities. So the most evident toll that we're seeing is the toll of human life. And it's not just for those who have died, but also for the many, many loved ones that have lost those people who have died. Then we add to that injuries. So injury is a word, and we kind of know what it means, but to appreciate it, we need to understand that these aren't necessarily conditions that in weeks or months will be healed up. Many of the injured will have lost a limb or an eye, their hearing or their teeth, or even an unborn child. Some of them will never be able to live independently again. And also, there are injuries that result from the unavailability of needed medications, food, and water. So it's far-reaching. When we think beyond injury and death, there's the loss of property. So, of course, we know their homes are destroyed or damaged beyond use. But then we have vehicles, we have artwork that people cherish, clothing, photographs, love letters, mementos that have been handed down for generations. The loss of businesses that have taken a lifetime to build up. And then there's the loss of the non-human companions, pets that are killed or injured or forever lost. And finally, I'll speak to one other loss, and that is emotional loss. Not everybody has the luxury of perfect mental health before the war began. And everyone subject to this invasion will suffer some level of trauma. But those who were less resilient beforehand will be much more severely affected. So the list goes on, but it's easy for us to see where compassion is triggered by what's happening in Ukraine. We practice this compassion by recognizing the truth of the situation, even though it's painful, by recognizing our connection with those people. It could as easily be us as them, a coincidence of birth as to who's born where. And if this feels hard, it's because it is. Now, the good news there is compassion has shown itself in a way that it rarely does. You can't drive down a residential street and not see a Ukrainian flag somewhere. We don't often see bipartisanship in our government, but we're seeing a lot of that in response to what's happening to Ukraine. The compassion that is arising from our country is somewhat unprecedented, and that's encouraging. That's cause for happiness. So the second Brahma Vihara that I want to talk about on the wing of compassion over here. Let's see, which one would be on the right? I don't know which one goes where. Is metta. And the definition I like of metta, or loving kindness, is an unconditional positive regard for all beings. Now, I said that it's very easy to see compassion arise based on what's happening in Ukraine. I will say the opposite of metta. I think metta can be particularly difficult because of what's happening in Ukraine. So we're turning our attention not just to the victims, but we're including all beings, and that includes the perpetrators. So we're getting into some challenging areas. There's not time, it's beyond the scope of this talk to explore metta fully. So to those of you who aren't so familiar with it, I apologize, but I want to make a few points about loving kindness practice, or metta. So first, it's easy to practice loving kindness for those that we love. The challenge is when we begin to move away from our circle of loved ones, and then we get to people that are more neutral, and then we start getting to people that are somewhat challenging, and then we get to people that are very challenging. And so that's where it gets a little tricky. But to the extent we exclude anyone at all from our metta practice, the benefit of our practice will be impaired by that. We work at it by taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and over time, we do begin to see progress. So one way we can connect with these difficult people, in the case of the aggressors in Ukraine, is to remember that there is a seed of goodness in everyone. One of the people involved in the aggression in Ukraine, 10 years from now, we may look over and that person may be sitting beside us in a Sangha meeting. The opportunity for us to all learn and grow is there. Also, we don't know the history of what has brought these people to the decisions they have made, but I don't have any doubt in my mind that it has included a huge amount of suffering to be able to do what is being done. One would have to be coming from a place of immense suffering. We can also remember our own unskillful actions in the past, and we can see a little bit of ourselves in these difficult people. We can see the unskillful urges that arise in us, and we can appreciate somewhat how they are being led down this path. So when we talk about metta, we want to make a clear distinction between including someone in our metta practice, and as I said, we want to include everyone to the extent we can. A distinction between including them and forgiving their actions. It's not the same thing. So actions have consequences, and metta does not require that we abandon accountability. We can wish for the end of the suffering of the aggressors. We can also simultaneously hope for accountability, hope that they are held accountable, and we can even experience compassion for the suffering that they are going to experience when they are held accountable. Most importantly, I would say about metta is we must remember that regardless of any impact on others, the heart practices are beneficial for us. Some of us understand that we can send metta or send karuna, compassion, to others and it will affect them. Other people understand differently that it doesn't transmit energetically, but it benefits us. What I would say, I'm not here to answer that question. What I would say is it always benefits us. And if it benefits others, then that's great. That's an extra benefit. But regardless, metta is worth practicing. Now, one thing I'll say about metta in the context of Ukraine is it can be hard to practice metta for people who are behaving so unkindly. A benefit we have from seeing what's happening right now is it reminds us how important it is to actively develop our metta practice. We need to be prepared for the next invasion so that we can more ably cultivate metta, and we don't want to be caught off guard So this is a reminder, this is a wake-up call that we need to be training ourselves in advance so that when metta is called for, it is available. So the other wing, the wisdom wing, I want to talk about that for a minute. And primarily what I want to talk about, the Pali word is dukkha. It's often translated as suffering. Also, another useful translation is unsatisfactoriness. So I'm imagining many of you were as shocked as I was when this invasion began. On some level, I believed that this kind of naked aggression by one country toward another was a thing of the past, that it didn't exist anymore. It all seemed so medieval. And it was a shocking wake-up call to see that it's still right there, lurking beneath the surface. So for me, the false sense of comfort I had constructed was just delusion. That is to say, a lack of wisdom. So we're talking about the wisdom wing here, and a lack of wisdom on my part lulled me into thinking something like this really couldn't happen. So there have been many steps toward a more peaceful world over the recent decades, but the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion have not been eliminated. There are still many, many people in positions of great power in many governments who are lost in these three poisons. And over time, this kind of power in the hands of people who are lost in these poisons will almost certainly result in great harm to many people. In his book, In the Buddha's Words, the monk Bhikkhu Bodhi explores the underlying roots of violent conflict and injustice. And I might have shared this quote last week, I'm not sure, but I'm going to share it now. What he says is, the Buddha does not clamor for changes merely in the outer structures of society. He demonstrates that these dark phenomena are external projections of the unwholesome proclivities of the human mind, and thus he points to the need for interchange as a parallel condition for establishing peace and social justice. He traces conflict, violence, political oppression, and economic injustice back to their causes, each in its own way located within the mind. So while this analysis seems true to me, it's not so encouraging. It's much easier to restrain somebody's behavior than it is to somehow cause them to do the inner work that is needed to change how they are in the world. I don't know that you can cause someone to do that. And when you restrain somebody, though, that's just a short-term solution. To the extent somebody really addresses the underlying causes, that's a more permanent solution, and it treats not just the symptom, but the cause of the problem. Now, sometimes the Buddha's approach to cultivating interchange can be understood as being passive or passivity. But I just want to read this sentence again. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi. He points to the need for interchange as a parallel condition for establishing peace and social justice. So interchange is not the exclusive remedy, it's just one part of our response. Active responses to stop evil are also appropriate, and in fact they're needed. So I find it helpful to think of this suffering think how to say this now. I'm aware of our time. It's really a balancing act between how much do we work on our inner relationship to what's happening and how much do we try to bring about change in the world. So the most gratifying situation is when we can take immediate action and bring about change, and we get immediate results. So if there's a small child getting ready to touch a hot stove, we can grab her arm and pull her away, and we've done something, and we see the benefit, and it's very satisfying. Less immediate but also satisfying is not one specific individual, but a condition that needs attention. So maybe we can make a donation to a charity that's working in a certain area, or maybe we can write letters to our elected officials and support legislation. And that might be the most active thing we can do with respect to Ukraine. And there is some satisfaction to that. Then when we move away from what we can do externally and move internally, it's awfully important, but it's not as immediately gratifying. There's not the immediate result. And so we really have to cultivate more wholesome mind states, and we have to replace greed, hatred, and delusion in our own minds with their opposites, and those are generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. The good news is these are permanent changes, and they will survive instead of being a temporary response to the symptoms. So pursuing this interchange is always appropriate. We need to see clearly. I need to stop thinking that this kind of event can't occur in the world. I need to cultivate more wisdom. I need to recognize the truth of the situation. And then, on top of that, I need to do whatever I can to change the result. So I'll conclude with another quote from Bhikkhu Bodhi, which fairly accurately, I think, describes what we've been witnessing. He says, "We behold a world in which human beings are driven helplessly toward old age and death, in which they are spun around by circumstances so that they are oppressed by bodily pain, cast down by failure and misfortune, made anxious and fearful by change and deterioration. It is a world in which people aspire to live in harmony, but in which their untrained emotions repeatedly compel them against their better judgment to lock horns in conflicts that escalate into violence and wholesale devastation." So if you were hoping tonight's talk might give you some magic that would make this whole Ukraine thing go away, I trust that I have disappointed you. But these teachings do have much to offer, and in my view, more to offer than any other way we can approach the situation. So in summary, we'll cultivate compassion for those who are affected by this invasion. We'll cultivate loving kindness for all beings, including the aggressors, to whatever extent we are able. We will do whatever we can externally to bring about less suffering, and we will cultivate wisdom through internal practice and study so that events like this don't come as a surprise to us, and we can respond in a more skillful way. So I will offer that for your consideration.